I need you to understand something before we begin. Something that is going to make you question everything you think you know about your government. Everything you think you know about the war on drugs. Everything you think you know about who the real criminals are in America. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan stood in front of the American people and said these words. He said, "We're taking down the drug dealers. We're going to win this war." Nancy Reagan appeared on television. She looked into the camera with those warm, caring eyes, and she told every child in America 2 simple words: just say no. The government built new prisons. The DEA arrested thousands of people. Entire communities were destroyed. Families were torn apart. Black and brown neighborhoods were flooded with police. People went to prison for decades. For marijuana, for cocaine, for crack. The message was clear. Drugs are evil. Drug dealers are criminals. The government is the good guy. That was the story they told you. Now let me tell you what was actually happening at the exact same time. At the exact same moment Reagan was giving those speeches, a government agency was actively helping smuggle cocaine into the United States. Not stopping it, not investigating it, helping it happen, protecting the people doing it, using the money and the operations to fund an illegal secret war that Congress had specifically legally forbidden. And when the pilot at the center of all of it was finally exposed, when he started talking, when he started naming names, the cartel sent 3 men with machine guns to a parking lot in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and they shot him to death. His name was Barry Seal. He was a pilot from Louisiana. He had soft hands, a big smile, and an absolutely terrifying amount of charm. He flew commercial airlines at 26 years old. He was one of the youngest captains in American aviation history. He had a family, a house, a legitimate life, and then he threw it all away. Because Barry Seal loved 2 things more than anything else in the world. He loved flying, and he loved money. He discovered that smuggling drugs combined both of those things perfectly. He started with marijuana. Then he graduated to cocaine. And eventually he graduated to working for the most powerful, most violent drug organization in the history of the world, the Medellin Cartel, Pablo Escobar's organization. The people who killed judges, blew up airplanes, and bribed entire governments. Barry Seal worked for them, and he made $50 million doing it. But here's the part that changes everything. Here's the part the movie doesn't tell you. Here's the part the government spent decades trying to bury. Barry Seal wasn't just working for the cartel, he was working for the CIA at the same time, on the same flights. The same planes that were bringing cocaine into the United States were flying weapons out to Nicaraguan rebels in a secret war that Congress had made completely illegal. The CIA knew he was bringing cocaine back. They knew. They had been told. And they allowed it. Because they needed him. Because their secret war was more important than the drugs flooding into American cities. This is not a conspiracy theory. I want to say that again because some of you are already skeptical, and I respect that. Skepticism is healthy, but this is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented. This is in congressional records. A United States Senate committee investigated this. Senator John Kerry led a formal investigation. The Kerry Committee report, published in 1989, is a public document. You can read it right now. It is called Drugs, Law Enforcement, and Foreign Policy. It runs hundreds of pages. It confirms, in the official language of the United States government, that the CIA used drug traffickers in their Contra operations, that they knew cocaine was being smuggled, that they looked away, that they protected the smugglers, that they betrayed the American people while telling those same people to just say no. Tom Cruise made a movie about Barry Seal in 2017. It was called American Made. It was entertaining. Tom Cruise was charming. There were fun flying sequences and comedic moments. It grossed over $134 million worldwide. And it told you about 30% of the truth, maybe less. The movie made Barry look like a lovable rogue having the adventure of his life. It made the CIA look like bumbling bureaucrats. It softened the story until it became entertainment. Until it became something you could watch on a Saturday night and feel good about. The real story is not something you feel good about. The real story makes you angry. The real story makes you realize that while the government was imprisoning regular Americans for drug crimes, some of the most powerful people in the United States were actively enabling the cocaine trade for political purposes. The real story shows you that the crack epidemic that destroyed black communities in the 1980s and 1990s was partly fueled by government-connected smuggling operations. The real story shows you that no one in the CIA was ever prosecuted. No one in the Reagan administration faced justice. The documents were classified, the cover-up worked, and Barry Seal was the one who ended up bleeding out in a parking lot. That's what I'm going to show you today. For the next 2 hours, we are going through the complete, documented, sourced story of Barry Seal. Every major claim I make is going to come from congressional testimony, court records, DEA files, FBI investigations, or verified journalism. When I'm certain, I'll tell you I'm certain. When something is estimated or disputed, I'll tell you that too, because the truth is powerful enough on its own. We don't need to exaggerate anything. The documented facts are more disturbing than most people's wildest theories. This is the pilot who worked for Pablo Escobar and the CIA simultaneously. This is the story of a secret war funded partly by cocaine. This is the story of how the government you were taught to trust betrayed you in one of the most brazen ways imaginable. And this is the story of how Barry Seal lived a life so insane, so impossible, so completely beyond the boundaries of normal human experience that even Hollywood couldn't tell it straight. Let's begin. Before we go any further, do one thing right now. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to see how far this reaches. I want to see how many people around the world are sitting down tonight to learn the truth about government drug trafficking. It matters to me. It tells me this work is reaching people. Hit subscribe right now if you want the real stories. Not the sanitized version, not the Hollywood version. The documented, researched, sourced truth about history's most insane stories. This video is part of my series on the real history behind movies. And I promise you, after 2 hours of this, you will never look at the war on drugs the same way again, like this video. I know that sounds transactional, but here's the thing. Exposing government drug trafficking is important content. The YouTube algorithm needs to know that. Your like tells the algorithm that this content matters, that it should reach more people, that the truth should spread. So if you believe people deserve to know what their government did, hit that like button right now. Here is what you are about to watch. The complete story of Barry Adler Berriman Seal. From his childhood in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he fell in love with airplanes at 15 years old, through his career as one of the most skilled commercial pilots in the country, through his transformation into one of the biggest drug smugglers in American history, through his recruitment by the CIA and his role in an illegal secret war, through his arrest, his testimony, his death in a parking lot at 46 years old, through the congressional investigations that confirmed what happened, and through the lessons that every American needs to understand about their government. You've seen American Made. Now see the truth. Let's begin with a boy from Louisiana who just wanted to fly. Adler Berriman Seal was born on July 16, 1939 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. His father was Benjamin Curtis Seal, a candy salesman. His mother was Mary Lou Del Camber Seal. They were a middle-class Catholic family, normal in almost every way. Barry, as everyone called him, grew up in a house with siblings, in a neighborhood with other kids, in a city that smelled like the Mississippi River and southern cooking and hot summer air. Nothing about his early childhood suggested what he would become. But there was one thing, one defining obsession that would shape everything that followed. Barry Seal was absolutely, completely, permanently obsessed with airplanes. From the time he was a small child, if there was a plane in the sky, Barry's eyes went to it. He would watch it until it disappeared over the horizon. He would lie in the grass for hours watching the sky. While other kids were playing baseball or chasing each other through neighborhoods, Barry was at the local airport, just watching, just staring at the machines that could pull themselves off the ground and into the air. He wasn't just fascinated by the idea of flying, he was fascinated by the mechanics of it. How does that thing stay up there? Why does that engine sound different from that one? What does the pilot see from up there? These weren't abstract questions for Barry. They were urgent. He needed to know. He needed to be the person asking them from inside the cockpit, not outside looking up. So he did something extraordinary. He started saving money. He did odd jobs around the neighborhood. He mowed lawns. He ran errands. He scraped together every dollar he could. And at 15 years old, in 1954, Barry Seal took his first flying lesson. 15 years old. Most kids that age are worried about homework and whether the person they like knows they exist. Barry was learning to pull a small plane off a runway and point it at the sky. His flight instructor saw something immediately. This kid had natural instinct. There are pilots who learn by the book, who memorize the procedures and execute them carefully, and who become competent and reliable and completely unremarkable. And then there are pilots who feel the plane, who understand intuitively what the aircraft wants to do, what the air is doing beneath the wings, what small corrections need to be made before they're even necessary. Barry Seal was the second kind. His instructor said he had a gift, not just talent, a gift, the kind of thing you can't teach. By 16, Barry had his student pilot license, the youngest age legally possible. By 17, he had his private pilot license. He was still in high school, he was still living with his parents, he was still, theoretically, just a kid from Baton Rouge. But in the air, he was already something else. In the air, Barry Seal was extraordinary. He said later, in one of the interviews he gave before his death, that flying was the only time he felt completely free. He said, "When I'm in the air, nothing else matters. Everything on the ground disappears." That quote matters because it tells you something essential about Barry Seal that explains every choice he ever made. He was addicted to freedom. He was addicted to the feeling of being untethered from consequences. In the air, there were no rules that applied to him the same way. There were the rules of physics, which he understood better than almost anyone, and there was his skill, which was exceptional. Everything else fell away, and Barry spent the rest of his life chasing that feeling, first through flying, then through money, then through the adrenaline of doing something incredibly dangerous and getting away with it. He attended Baton Rouge High School. He was not a great student, average grades, not much interest in the subjects that didn't relate to aviation. He had a girlfriend named Deborah DuBois, who he had known since they were young, who he would eventually marry. He graduated in 1957, and the moment he had that diploma in his hand, he moved immediately toward the only thing that had ever interested him. Right after high school, Barry joined the Louisiana Army National Guard. Now here's why this matters. The National Guard offered something Barry desperately needed: advanced flight training. The military trains pilots for free, and they train them on aircraft that civilian pilots rarely get access to. Sophisticated multi-engine planes. Equipment that teaches techniques that take civilian pilots years and thousands of dollars to learn. Barry understood this calculation perfectly. Join the Guard, get the training, build the hours, and launch from there. He was right about all of it. The military training accelerated his development as a pilot significantly. He flew cargo planes, transport aircraft, anything they would let him near. And simultaneously, he was building flight hours in the civilian world, taking any job he could find that involved getting into an aircraft. Crop dusting, cargo runs, whatever was available. Because to become a commercial airline pilot, you need thousands and thousands of flight hours. It's not just about skill, it's about accumulated experience, about having seen enough situations in the air that nothing surprises you anymore. Barry accumulated those hours faster than almost anyone because he flew every chance he got. Because every hour in the air was an hour he was exactly where he wanted to be. He wasn't building a career, he was feeding a hunger. In 1962, at 23 years old, Barry Seal was hired by Trans World Airlines, TWA. This was one of the major commercial carriers in the United States at the time, famous routes across the country and internationally. Getting hired by TWA was significant. It meant you had cleared all the checks, passed all the tests, met a standard that disqualified most applicants. Barry had done it at 23, which was young. Very young for commercial aviation. He started as a flight engineer, which is the entry-level position in the cockpit hierarchy. Then he became a co-pilot. And then, at 26 years old, Barry Seal became a captain on the Boeing 707. The captain is the pilot in command, the person responsible for the aircraft, the crew, and every single passenger on board. The 707 was a jet aircraft, a real, modern, sophisticated machine. And Barry Seal was one of the youngest 707 captains in the history of American commercial aviation. Think about what this meant for a kid from Baton Rouge who was mowing lawns to pay for flying lessons 10 years earlier. He was now commanding jet aircraft across the country. He was making serious money. In the 1960s, a TWA captain's salary was roughly $30,000 a year. Adjusted for inflation, that's somewhere around $300,000 in today's money. He had benefits, stability, prestige, and a career that most people would have considered not just successful, but genuinely remarkable. And yet, it wasn't enough. This is the thing about Barry Seal that makes him so impossible to fully understand and so completely human at the same time. He had everything most people wanted, and he wanted more. Not because he was starving or desperate, not because he was facing some terrible financial hardship, but because Barry Seal was wired for excess. He liked expensive things. Nice cars, beautiful houses, the best of everything. And $30,000 a year, even adjusted for the era, didn't cover the lifestyle he was building in his head. His colleagues at TWA described him as supremely confident. Not arrogant exactly, but absolutely certain of himself in a way that could be magnetic and occasionally infuriating. He loved flying. He was brilliant at it. Everyone agreed on that. But he also loved the idea of being the most interesting person in any room, of having the best story, of being the one who had done something everyone else only dreamed about. And flying commercial airlines, as extraordinary as it was, eventually became routine. Eventually became just a job. So in the late 1960s, while he was still flying for TWA, while he was still a legitimate, credentialed, respected commercial pilot, Barry Seal started smuggling. The first thing he smuggled wasn't drugs, it was explosives. Specifically, C4 plastic explosives. He was smuggling them into Mexico for anti-Castro Cuban exiles who were paying him to move weapons. This seems almost impossibly reckless, and it is. But think about what it tells you about how Barry's mind worked. He wasn't afraid of the consequences in any meaningful, practical way. He looked at the risk calculation and decided the money was worth it. He looked at his skill set and decided he could pull it off. And he was right. For a while. He hid the explosives in his personal luggage on TWA flights, the same commercial flights carrying regular passengers. This is important to understand. He wasn't doing this on some small cargo plane in the middle of nowhere. He was carrying military-grade plastic explosives in luggage on passenger aircraft. The level of recklessness involved is staggering. If something had gone wrong, if there had been an inspection, if the explosives had somehow detonated, the consequences would have been catastrophic for passengers who had no idea what was in the hold below them. But nothing went wrong. He got paid. He did it again. He got paid again. And each time the consequences didn't materialize, Barry Seal's confidence grew a little more. His sense that the rules didn't quite apply to him the same way they applied to everyone else got a little stronger. This is how it always starts with people like Barry. Not with one giant leap into criminality, but with small successes. Small violations that work out. Each one reinforcing the belief that you're smarter than the system, that you'll be the exception. In 1972, the exception ended. TWA found out. The investigation uncovered enough to know that Barry had been smuggling. They couldn't prove every trip, couldn't pin down every detail, but they knew enough. In July of 1972, Barry Seal was fired from Trans World Airlines. He was 33 years old. He was blacklisted from commercial aviation. No major airline was going to touch him now. The legitimate career was over. Most people facing that outcome would have found a different path, would have reckoned with what they'd risked, what they'd lost, and redirected their energy towards something legal. Barry Seal looked at the situation and made a completely different calculation. He had been smuggling on the side. He was good at it. The only reason he'd lost his airline career was that he hadn't been careful enough. So the solution was not to stop smuggling. The solution was to get better at it. He went full-time. Let me explain exactly how drug smuggling worked, because I want you to understand precisely what Barry was doing. Not in vague terms. In actual, specific, practical terms, because understanding the mechanics is essential to understanding the scale of what followed. Drug smuggling in the 1970s was, at its core, a logistics business. The drugs existed in one place, money existed in another place. The job was to move the drugs to where the money was. Simple concept. Brutally complicated execution. You needed planes that couldn't be traced. You needed routes that avoided radar detection. You needed landing sites that weren't monitored by law enforcement. You needed networks of people who could receive the drugs and distribute them without getting caught. And you needed pilots who were skilled enough to execute the flying part without killing themselves or getting intercepted. Barry had been in this world long enough to understand it. He started small. Marijuana, initially. He bought small aircraft, paid for in cash, registered under fake names or shell companies so they couldn't be easily traced back to him. He flew to Mexico. He landed at remote locations, fields, or rough dirt strips far from any official infrastructure where suppliers were waiting with the product. He loaded the plane with hundreds of pounds of marijuana, and then he flew back to the United States. The actual crossing was the most dangerous part. He flew low, very low, below the threshold where radar systems would reliably pick him up. He flew at night when visual detection from the ground was nearly impossible. He crossed the border at remote stretches, far from any city or checkpoint, over desert or empty land where no one was watching. He had studied the radar coverage maps, he knew the gaps, he knew where you could slip through, and he had the flying skill to do it without GPS navigation, without the sophisticated equipment that modern pilots take for granted, just instruments and instinct and thousands of hours of experience. He landed at remote airstrips in Louisiana, Texas, or Arizona, properties owned by associates or land he'd purchased himself for exactly this purpose. Trucks were waiting. The cocaine would be unloaded in minutes. Barry would fly away immediately. The entire operation, from landing to departure, was designed to be over before anyone had time to respond to anything suspicious. And for every trip, he made between $10,000 and $20,000. That sounds significant, but here's the thing. He was doing multiple trips every month. In the 1970s, he was pulling in over $100,000 a month from marijuana smuggling. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $500,000 a month in today's money. Tax-free, cash. This was the life Barry Seal built, and he was extraordinarily good at it. His reputation in the smuggling world grew. People talked about him the way they talk about the best in any field. You'd hear his name and know this was someone reliable, someone skilled, someone who delivered what he promised. In a world full of people who cut corners, who panicked, who got caught or got greedy in the wrong moment, Barry Seal was different. He was professional, he was precise, and he never lost a load. His family saw a successful businessman. He had a nice house in Baton Rouge, nice cars. His wife Deborah saw a man who traveled a lot for work, who ran some kind of cargo operation she didn't ask too many questions about, who provided well, and came home and played with the kids. This was the facade Barry maintained with extraordinary discipline. The Barry that the neighborhood saw and the Barry that the cartel knew were two completely different people, and he kept them separated. But he was also spending like a man who didn't believe the money would last. Mansions, multiple aircraft, expensive cars, boats, whatever he wanted. Barry Seal had no instinct for saving. He had an instinct for acquiring. And the more he made, the more he spent, and the more he needed to make. The cycle fed itself. By the late 1970s, Barry was looking at math and making a business decision. Marijuana was good, the profit margins were real. Buy for $100 a pound in Mexico, sell for $500 a pound in the United States. A 5 times return on investment. That's excellent by any measure. But cocaine was something else entirely. The cocaine coming out of Colombia in the late 1970s could be purchased for roughly $2,000 a kilogram at the source. The same kilogram, once it crossed into the United States, was worth $50,000. That's not a 5 times return. That's a 25 times return. The same smuggling operation, the same aircraft, the same routes, the same risk, and 25 times the profit. Barry Seal was many things, but he wasn't slow with numbers. He made the shift, and when he shifted to cocaine, the already substantial money he was making became truly extraordinary. He was moving from wealthy to genuinely, extravagantly, offensively rich. The kind of money that changes how you see the world. The kind of money that makes you feel untouchable. By 1980, Barry Seal was one of the most successful independent drug smugglers in the United States. Not working for any organization in particular, running his own operation. His own planes, his own routes, his own network, making his own decisions. This had advantages: independence, control, no one he had to answer to. But it also had a problem. He was getting noticed, the DEA was developing information on him, local law enforcement in Louisiana was watching, informants were reporting on him, he was spending too much money too visibly. The mansion in Baton Rouge, the fleet of vehicles, the aircraft, none of it was consistent with any legitimate business income. And in a world where law enforcement follows the money, conspicuous wealth is a flashing red light. Barry needed protection. He needed either to disappear into anonymity, which was never his style, or he needed someone powerful enough that law enforcement would think twice about coming after him. He was about to find both of those things, in the worst possible combination, because the people who came calling next were the most dangerous organization in the Western Hemisphere. and they were going to change everything. Before I tell you how Barry Seal met the Medellin cartel, I need to make sure you understand exactly what the Medellin cartel was, because drug cartel gets thrown around so casually today that it's easy to lose track of what we're actually talking about. The Medellin cartel wasn't just a criminal organization, it was, by some measures, the most powerful criminal organization that has ever existed. And I want you to feel the weight of what it meant for Barry Seal to be sitting across a table from these people. The cartel was based in Medellin, Colombia. Colombia, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, was a country struggling with poverty, political instability, and a geography that made it perfect for cocaine production. The mountain ranges of the Andes created ideal growing conditions for coca plants, and a group of extraordinarily ruthless, extraordinarily intelligent businessmen looked at that geography and built an empire. The leadership included several key figures. Pablo Escobar was the most famous, and we'll get to him specifically in a moment. But the organization was actually built heavily by the Ochoa family. Jorge Luis Ochoa Vasquez was one of the primary architects of the cartel's logistics. His brothers Juan David and Fabio Ochoa were also deeply involved. Carlos Later, a German-Colombian businessman with a gift for logistics and a genuinely disturbing personality, was responsible for the smuggling infrastructure, including the purchase of an island in the Bahamas that he used as a refueling station. And then there was Pablo Escobar, who was the face, the muscle, and increasingly the dominant figure. At its peak, the Medellin cartel was responsible for somewhere between 70 and 80% of all the cocaine entering the United States. Think about that number. 80% of everything. They weren't just successful drug traffickers. They had essentially cornered the market, and they were making money at a scale that defied comprehension. Estimates of their peak revenue run to multiple billions of dollars per year. Pablo Escobar at his peak was worth an estimated $30 billion. He was literally one of the richest people on earth. But they weren't just rich. They were violent in a way that set a different standard for what criminal violence could look like. The Medellin cartel didn't just kill rivals. They killed prosecutors. They killed judges. They killed presidential candidates. They bombed a commercial airliner, killing over 100 passengers to try to kill one informant they believed was on board. They declared open warfare on the Colombian government and the Colombian people. They called this policy plata o plomo, silver or lead. You take our money or you take our bullets. There was no third option. These were the people Barry Seal decided to work for. By 1981, Barry's reputation had spread beyond his immediate circle. The Medellin cartel had a problem. They had enormous quantities of cocaine. They had distribution networks in the United States waiting for it. What they didn't have was reliable American pilots who could make the runs consistently, professionally, and without getting caught. American pilots were valuable for a specific reason. They understood American airspace. They understood American law enforcement patterns. They knew which routes worked and which ones got people arrested. And they were harder for U.S. Customs and DEA to identify as suspicious than Colombian nationals. Barry Seal was exactly what they were looking for. He had the skills, he had the reputation, and he had a track record of success. The approach came through intermediaries. The cartel didn't just call someone up and offer them a job. There was a process. Information was passed through trusted contacts. Meetings were arranged in neutral locations, and eventually Barry Seal found himself in Honduras, sitting across a table from Jorge Ochoa. Ochoa made him an offer. The terms were straightforward. Barry would fly cocaine from Colombia to the United States. He would be paid $500,000 per trip. There would be as many trips as Barry could handle. The cartel would provide the product, the loading infrastructure in Colombia, and the distribution contacts in the United States. Barry would provide the aircraft and the pilot. $500,000 per trip. Let me put that in context. At $30,000 a year from TWA, Barry would have had to work 16 years to make what a single trip now paid him. He was making $10,000 or $20,000 a trip smuggling marijuana. The cartel was offering him 50 times that for the same basic job, different cargo, same skill set. Barry said yes. He said yes, without significant hesitation, based on every account of this meeting. He didn't need days to think it over. He didn't agonize over the moral implications, or if he did, the agonizing was brief. He saw a business opportunity. He had the skills to exploit it, and the money was more than he could have imagined earning in any other way. So he said yes, shook hands, and became part of the most powerful drug organization in the world. I want to walk you through exactly how the smuggling operations work, step by step, because the scale of what Barry Seal was doing is something most people have never really grasped, and understanding the mechanics makes the rest of the story make sense. Barry assembled a fleet of aircraft, not just one plane, multiple planes. He spent millions of dollars on aircraft. He used Piper Senecas, twin-engine planes with good range and load capacity. He used Cessna 210s for smaller runs. He used Aero Commanders, aircraft known for their durability and reliability. Each plane was registered under shell companies, fake businesses that existed only on paper, with no connection to Barry Seal's real identity. If one plane was seized, the others were untouched. If one identity was compromised, the rest remained clean. The flights originated in Colombia. Barry would fly from his base in Louisiana to Colombia, often with false documentation and filed flight plans that claimed legitimate business purposes. He would land at remote jungle airstrips. These weren't airports. They were rough strips carved into the jungle, maintained by cartel workers, unmarked on any official map, and defended by armed guards. The cartel had multiple strips across Colombia, rotating their use to avoid establishing predictable patterns. While Barry waited at the strip, the cartel workers loaded the cocaine. The amounts varied by trip, typically 300 to 500 kilograms. 300 kilograms is about 660 pounds. 500 kilograms is 1,100 pounds. This was serious weight in a small aircraft. The pilots had to know their plane's performance characteristics intimately to make those loads work. Too much weight, and the plane couldn't climb properly. Too much weight at altitude, and performance degraded dangerously. Barry knew his aircraft well enough to push them to their limits without crossing into catastrophe. The return flight from Colombia to Louisiana covered roughly 1,500 miles. Over the Caribbean, over the Gulf of Mexico, 6 to 8 hours of flying, depending on the plane and the winds. He flew low, much lower than commercial aircraft. Low enough that the radar systems of the era would often fail to paint him consistently. He flew at night when visual detection from boats or coastlines was minimized. He flew without filing a flight plan, which was illegal but undetectable unless someone was specifically watching for it. And then he landed in Louisiana. Remote private land, airstrips he had purchased specifically for this purpose, or locations controlled by trusted associates. Trucks were waiting, the transfer was fast, 15 minutes, 30 minutes at most. The cocaine was loaded into vehicles and driven away. Barry took off immediately. By the time law enforcement could have responded to anything suspicious, he was already gone. His cut was $500,000 cash. Sometimes the cartel paid in cocaine, which Barry could then sell himself for even more profit. In a good month with multiple trips, he was making well over $1 million. Over the course of the cartel years, from 1981 to 1984, Barry Seal made somewhere between $25 and $50 million. Some estimates go higher. The precise figure is hard to establish because cash transactions of this scale leave deliberately minimal records. But the money isn't the most important thing to understand about these operations. The most important thing is the volume of cocaine. Because every kilogram Barry Seal flew into the United States didn't stay in a warehouse. It moved through distribution networks. It was cut and divided and sold in cities across the country. Some of it became powder cocaine, the expensive kind for the professional classes who could afford it, but much of it, especially as the 1980s progressed and the chemistry evolved, became crack cocaine. A smokable, intensely addictive, and extraordinarily cheap derivative that absolutely devastated poor urban communities. The cocaine Barry Seal brought into the country was not an abstraction. It became addiction. It became overdoses. It became violence between dealers fighting over territory. It became children growing up watching their parents disappear into dependency. It became entire neighborhoods hollowed out, entire generations diminished. Barry Seal flew in multiple loads per month for years. The total volume across his entire career is estimated in the thousands of kilograms. Some estimates run much higher. He didn't think about this. Or if he thought about it, he filed it away somewhere that his daily consciousness couldn't reach. Barry Seal thought about logistics. He thought about the next flight, the next payment, the next obstacle to overcome. He was a businessman solving transportation problems. The contents of the containers were not his concern. This is not an excuse. It's a psychological portrait. He knew exactly what he was doing. He just didn't allow himself to face the full weight of it. In 1982 or 1983, depending on which account you trust, Barry Seal met Pablo Escobar in person. By this point, Barry had become one of the cartel's most valuable assets. His track record was perfect. He hadn't lost a load, he hadn't been caught, he was professional, reliable, and apparently incapable of panic. For an organization where most problems were solved with violence, Barry Seal was an unusual figure, someone who solved problems with competence. Escobar wanted to meet him. The meetings happened in Colombia, at properties controlled by Escobar, and what Barry described afterward in the conversations he had with law enforcement and in his court testimony was a portrait of someone deeply disturbing precisely because of how normal he could seem. Escobar was soft-spoken. He was polite. He asked questions and listened carefully to the answers. He was, in the moments Barry saw him, genuinely pleasant company. Barry described him as intelligent in a way that was immediately apparent, a quality Barry respected. And then, in the same conversation, Escobar might mention casually that someone had caused a problem that day and had been dealt with. Murder, discussed in the same tone you'd use to mention that you'd handled a billing dispute. The casualness of it was what was disturbing. Not anger, not even satisfaction, just the flat administrative tone of someone for whom ending a human life was an operational decision like any other. Barry said of Escobar in substance, he was the nicest guy who could order your death without blinking. That combination of sociability and absolute ruthlessness was something Barry found both fascinating and terrifying. And Barry Seal was not easily terrified. He had been doing dangerous things for years. He had a high threshold for risk. But something about Escobar registered as a different category of danger, a different magnitude. His main working relationship within the cartel was actually with Jorge Ochoa, rather than Escobar directly. Ochoa was his primary contact, the person who arranged the logistics, confirmed the shipments, coordinated the payments. Barry and Ochoa developed something that approached friendship in the way that two people who trust each other with operational details and money can develop a rapport that mimics friendship without quite being it. Carlos Lader, who owned a small island in the Bahamas that he used as a refueling stop, was also part of Barry's operational network. The cartel liked Barry for all the obvious reasons. He was effective. He was American, which made him useful in ways that Colombian nationals couldn't be. He didn't ask questions that weren't relevant to the job, and he had a quality that drug traffickers prize above almost everything else. He was consistent. You knew what you were getting with Barry Seal. In a business built on paranoia, consistency was invaluable. By 1983, Barry Seal was living a life of such extravagance that it was becoming its own problem. He owned a mansion in Baton Rouge, not just a nice house, a mansion. He had a private ranch. He owned a fleet of vehicles, Porsches and Mercedes and trucks and boats. He owned multiple aircraft that he could describe as business assets for people who didn't look too closely. He wore expensive watches. He bought whatever he wanted. This was the Barry Seal that people in Baton Rouge saw, a successful businessman who was clearly doing very well, though it wasn't always entirely clear in what. His family life was more complicated. He was married to Deborah, his second wife, with multiple children. His family knew that something about what Barry did wasn't quite normal. The cash, the strange hours, the frequent travel, the aircraft, the associates who showed up and spoke quietly and left. But Barry maintained the businessman cover with enough consistency that questions were deflected. And in a family dynamic where a father provides extremely well and makes clear that certain subjects are not open for discussion, questions have a way of not getting asked. He was also, despite the millions, always spending close to what he was making. The lifestyle absorbed the money as fast as it came in. This is another pattern that appears repeatedly in the lives of people like Barry Seal. The spending isn't irrational exactly. It's a function of not believing it can last. If some part of you knows that this ends badly, that it ends in arrest or violence or both, then there's a certain logic to spending now. You can't take it with you. You might as well have the cars. But the spending was also creating visibility. And visibility was becoming a serious problem. The DEA had information on him. Louisiana State Police were watching. Federal investigations were being opened. The CIA, as we'll discuss in detail, had been monitoring him for some time and had their own plans. Barry was generating law enforcement interest from multiple directions simultaneously, and the protection he had, the cartel's reputation, and his own careful operational security was not going to be sufficient indefinitely. He needed either to disappear or to find a protector powerful enough to hold law enforcement at bay. And incredibly, impossibly, he found that protector. But the price was something that Barry Seal probably didn't fully calculate when he agreed to it. The price was becoming the kind of asset that is protected only as long as it's useful. And when it stops being useful, it's left exposed. To understand why the CIA came looking for Barry Seal, you have to understand what was happening in Nicaragua in the early 1980s. And I want to explain this as clearly as possible because the geopolitics underpinning this story are complicated. And if you don't understand them, the CIA's behavior seems insane. Once you understand them, it only seems criminal. Nicaragua is a country in Central America. In 1979, a revolutionary movement called the Sandinistas overthrew the Somoza dictatorship and took power. The Sandinistas were left-wing, they had relationships with Cuba, they were receiving some support from the Soviet Union. In the context of the Cold War, which was the defining lens through which the Reagan administration viewed everything, this was unacceptable. A communist-aligned government in Central America was a potential domino. If Nicaragua fell to the left, the thinking went, Honduras might follow, then El Salvador, then Mexico. The paranoia of the Cold War turned small Central American countries into existential battlegrounds. President Reagan was absolutely committed to rolling back the Sandinista government. He believed it with the fervor of someone who had made it a personal crusade. He called the Contra rebels, the forces trying to overthrow the Sandinistas, freedom fighters. He wanted to arm them, fund them, train them, and support them however it took. There was a problem. Congress didn't agree. The American public had fresh memories of Vietnam. The idea of getting involved in another Central American conflict, funding another proxy war, watching more American resources and potentially American lives get consumed by a guerrilla conflict in the jungle was deeply unpopular. Congress reflected that unpopularity. And in 1982, Congress passed something called the Boland Amendment. The Boland Amendment was simple and explicit. It was a law that forbade the United States government from providing any funding, training, or support to the Contra rebels with the purpose of overthrowing the Nicaraguan government. Direct, clear, specific. The law was passed. The president signed it. It was the law of the land. The CIA proceeded to violate it anyway. This is not speculation. This is documented. This came out in the Iran-Contra hearings. CIA Director William Casey and National Security Council aide Oliver North were the primary architects of a secret program to continue supporting the Contras despite the congressional prohibition. They were going to fund the secret war, whether Congress permitted it or not. The only question was how. They needed several things. They needed money. They needed weapons. They needed the ability to deliver those weapons without it appearing on any official budget, any congressional report, any document that might surface and expose what they were doing. They needed, in short, a shadow logistics operation. A smuggler with aircraft and experience and the willingness to keep his mouth shut. They found Barry Seal. The CIA had been monitoring Barry Seal's operations for some time before they made contact. The DEA had shared information with them. The intelligence community knew who Barry was and what he was doing. From the CIA's perspective, this made Barry simultaneously a threat and a potential asset. He was a drug smuggler, which was illegal, but he was also an extraordinarily skilled pilot with existing Central American connections, with the infrastructure to run covert air operations, and with the pragmatic relationship to rules that made him potentially very useful. The approach was made through intermediaries. The CIA does not knock on drug smugglers' doors and hand them business cards. There is a process. A contact reaches out to someone Barry trusted. That someone passes along the message. A meeting is arranged at a location that isn't traceable. And eventually Barry Seal found himself in a room with people who represented the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States government. The offer was structured to appeal to everything Barry cared about. First, protection. The DEA was building a case against him. State and federal investigations were converging. Without intervention, Barry was looking at arrest and prosecution on charges that carried life in prison. The CIA could make that go away. They could reach out to the DEA and have Barry classified as a protected asset, someone who was off limits for prosecution because they were working with the intelligence community. This was enormously valuable to Barry. Second, money. The CIA would pay him for the operations he conducted on their behalf. Not the $50 million he was making from the cartel, but real money nonetheless. Third, something harder to quantify: adventure, status. The sense of operating at the absolute highest level of the clandestine world. Barry Seal, small-time pilot from Baton Rouge, working directly with the CIA on operations that affected geopolitical outcomes. There was something irresistible about that for a man who had always needed to be the most extraordinary person in any room. The CIA's proposition was this: Barry would continue flying. He would fly reconnaissance missions over Nicaragua, photographing Sandinista military installations. He would deliver weapons to Contra forces in Honduras and Nicaragua. He would provide intelligence on cartel operations that the CIA could use as leverage, and in exchange, the CIA would protect him from domestic law enforcement. Now here is the critical part, the part that makes this story more than just an interesting historical footnote. The CIA knew about the cocaine. They were fully aware that Barry's flights were bringing cocaine back into the United States. This wasn't something Barry hid from them or that slipped past their intelligence. They knew, and the decision was made at some level within the organization to allow it, to look away, to decide that the Nicaragua operation was more important than stopping the cocaine. This decision, made by people in air-conditioned offices in Langley, Virginia, resulted in hundreds of tons of cocaine entering the United States. It fueled the crack epidemic. It destroyed communities. It killed people. And no one was ever prosecuted for making it. The agreement between Barry Seal and the CIA was not a written contract. That should be obvious. This was a covert relationship between a government intelligence agency and a criminal, and putting it in writing would defeat the entire purpose. The arrangement was verbal, confirmed through actions, enforced through mutual interest and mutual vulnerability. Barry would fly for the CIA. The CIA would protect him from the DEA. There is documentation of this arrangement in the congressional record. The Kerry Committee report in 1989 confirmed that the CIA had used drug traffickers in Contra operations. It confirmed that people like Barry Seal had operated with CIA knowledge and protection. These aren't allegations. They are findings of a Senate investigation conducted by elected officials with subpoena power and access to classified documents. The specific mechanics of the CIA protection are documented in DEA records as well. DEA agents who were building cases against Barry Seal were told to stand down. The language used varied, but the substance was consistent. Barry Seal was a protected asset. He was working with the intelligence community. His file was to be treated as sensitive. Active investigation was to be suspended. DEA agents who pushed back on this were overruled. Some of them were furious about it. Some of them went on record with their anger years later during congressional investigations. They had the evidence, they had the case, and they were told by people above them in the federal hierarchy to walk away from it. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire story. The drug enforcement apparatus of the United States government was actively blocked from prosecuting one of the biggest cocaine smugglers in American history by another part of the same government because the cocaine was less important than the politics. For Barry, the arrangement felt, initially at least, like he had finally found the perfect situation. He was making enormous money from the cartel. He was protected by the CIA. He was doing exciting, high-stakes intelligence work. He was flying missions over Nicaragua and delivering weapons to Contras. He was playing multiple sides of a geopolitical conflict. He was, by any objective measure, one of the most improbably positioned individuals in the entire apparatus of American foreign policy in the early 1980s. He thought he was untouchable. Let me be specific about how the operations actually functioned during this CIA period from approximately 1983 to 1985, because understanding the mechanics makes the scandal concrete rather than abstract. Barry's flights had effectively two legs. The outbound leg ran from the United States to Central America. On these flights, the cargo was weapons. Rifles, typically M16s, ammunition, and other military supplies were loaded onto Barry's aircraft at locations in Louisiana and Arkansas. These weapons were destined for Contra forces operating along the Honduran-Nicaraguan border. Barry would land at remote airstrips in Honduras, where Contra representatives and sometimes CIA officers received the cargo. The weapons would be offloaded. Contra fighters would move them toward the border. and then Barry would fly the other direction. The return leg ran from Colombia to the United States. Barry would connect with cartel contacts, usually in Colombia but sometimes at intermediate points, and the cocaine would be loaded. The same aircraft that had just delivered weapons for an illegal American proxy war in Nicaragua was now flying cocaine into the United States. Same pilot, same airframe, different cargo. The cartel paid Barry for the cocaine runs. The CIA paid him separately for the weapons runs. He was being paid by both sides, which made him, in a very real sense, a man with no sides, a contractor, loyal only to the money, and the money was coming from everywhere. The Mena, Arkansas operation became a significant hub for all of this. Mena is a small town in western Arkansas, home to a regional airport called the Intermountain Regional Airport. Barry used this airport extensively during the CIA period. Why Mena? Several reasons. It was geographically convenient, close to Louisiana. It was remote enough that unusual air traffic attracted less scrutiny than it would at a major facility, and the local infrastructure supported the kinds of maintenance and modification work that Barry's aircraft required. Arkansas State Police knew that something unusual was happening in Mena. They documented strange flights, unmarked aircraft, armed men, cash transactions. They investigated, and then their investigations stalled. Federal agencies that they expected to cooperate didn't cooperate. Cases that should have moved forward didn't move forward. The protective hand of the CIA made itself felt, not through direct intervention most of the time, but through the absence of the normal law enforcement follow-through that should have occurred. Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas for most of this period. He would later become president. The question of what Clinton knew about Mena has been debated extensively. Clinton has consistently denied any specific knowledge of Barry Seal's operations. There is no documented evidence that Clinton was directly aware or personally involved in protecting Barry's activities. What we know for certain is that the operations happened in his state, that state law enforcement was aware and couldn't get federal cooperation, and that no serious action was taken. What we cannot establish based on available evidence is that Clinton personally knew what was happening or played any active role. I want to be clear about that distinction. This is a story with enough proven facts that we don't need to reach for unproven ones. In 1984, the CIA gave Barry Seal a mission that would ultimately contribute to his death. They asked him to photograph Pablo Escobar. The CIA's stated reasoning was that they wanted evidence of Escobar working with the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. The narrative they wanted to construct was that the Medellin cartel was connected to communist Nicaragua, which would justify various political and intelligence activities and would provide propaganda value in the ongoing struggle against the Sandinistas. Whether this connection was real or manufactured, whether the CIA actually believed it or just wanted the photos for political purposes, is something the documents don't fully clarify. What we know is that Barry was tasked with obtaining photographs of Escobar and other cartel figures at a location in Nicaragua. He was given a hidden camera. He arranged a meeting with Escobar at a location in Nicaragua, telling the cartel it was for a logistics discussion. He photographed Escobar, Jorge Ochoa, and Nicaraguan officials together. And then the CIA leaked the photographs to the media. The photos appeared in major American newspapers. They showed Pablo Escobar and other cartel figures in Nicaragua, allegedly demonstrating the connection between the drug trade and the Sandinista government. The Reagan administration used them as propaganda. "Look," they said, "the drug traffickers and the communists are working together. This is what we're fighting." But the leak destroyed Barry Seal's cover. The cartel now knew that someone had been photographing their leadership in what they had believed was a private meeting. They knew that someone in their operation was working against them. They started asking questions, and the answers pointed toward Barry. The trust that Barry had built with the Medellin cartel over years of reliable work began to fracture. Escobar, who was not a man given to patience or forgiveness where betrayal was concerned, started making inquiries. The relationship that had made Barry millions was curdling into something dangerous. He had made enemies who had virtually unlimited resources and absolutely no hesitation about using violence. Barry Seal had managed, through a combination of skill, greed, and extraordinary recklessness, to put himself in a position where he was simultaneously working for the CIA, the Medellin cartel, and feeding information back to U.S. law enforcement. And each of those relationships required him to conceal it from the other two. He was maintaining an impossibly complex web of deceptions, and the web was starting to tear. I need to stop here and make sure we don't move through the CIA period without fully accounting for what was happening with the cocaine, because the politics and the spy thriller aspects of the story are compelling. But cocaine is a human cost, and it can't be allowed to become background. During the CIA period from roughly 1983 to 1985, Barry Seal was making multiple runs per year. Combined with everything that came before, the estimates of total cocaine smuggled by Barry Seal across his career run into the hundreds of thousands of kilograms. The Kerry Committee report documented that CIA-connected smuggling operations brought massive quantities of cocaine into the United States. Barry was not the only smuggler in these networks. There were others. The total volume was staggering. This cocaine, entering the United States in the early to mid-1980s, arrived at precisely the moment when the chemistry of crack cocaine was being developed and spread. Crack is cocaine converted into a smokable form through a simple chemical process. It's far more immediately addictive than powder cocaine. It's dramatically cheaper, making it accessible to people who couldn't afford the powder form, and it spread through poor urban communities, primarily Black and Latino neighborhoods, with catastrophic speed. The crack epidemic of the mid to late 1980s is one of the most devastating social catastrophes in modern American history. Addiction rates exploded, overdose deaths multiplied, infant mortality increased as babies were born addicted. Gang violence around crack territory became epidemic. The prison population swelled as mandatory minimum sentencing laws passed specifically targeting crack cocaine put users and small-scale dealers behind bars for decades. Communities that had been struggling were pushed into crisis. The damage was generational. Children who grew up during the crack epidemic in affected neighborhoods carried the trauma and the consequences for the rest of their lives. The government's response to the crack epidemic was the war on drugs. More police, more prisons, harsher sentences, zero tolerance. The people who went to prison for crack cocaine were overwhelmingly Black. The sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine was 100 to 1. You needed 100 times more powder cocaine to trigger the same mandatory minimum sentence that crack cocaine triggered. This disparity, widely acknowledged as racially biased in its effects, persisted for decades. And while all of this was happening, while communities were being destroyed and people were being imprisoned, the CIA was allowing cocaine to flow into the country. The people who were making and enforcing the laws about drugs were connected, through the operations we've been discussing, to the supply chain that was producing the epidemic. This is not a metaphor. This is a documented, investigated, congressional record fact. The system that was imprisoning Black Americans for crack cocaine had knowingly allowed the cocaine supply that fueled it. This is the part of the Barry Seal story that demands to be said plainly and without softening. The CIA's protection of Barry Seal was effective for a period, but it was not absolute, and it was not permanent. And as the pressure built from multiple directions simultaneously, the protection began to show its limits. The DEA had agents who were genuinely angry. They had built cases, they had evidence, they knew what Barry Seal was doing, they knew the scale of it, and they were being told by people above them to back off a cocaine smuggler because he was working with the intelligence community. This created a level of institutional frustration that eventually found outlets. Some DEA agents pursued investigations through channels that were harder for the CIA to reach. Louisiana State Police were not under federal authority the same way DEA field offices were. State investigations could proceed with more independence. And Louisiana State Police investigators had been watching Barry's operations with considerable interest. They documented flights, they documented meetings, they documented the money moving through Barry's accounts and properties. They built a case that didn't require federal cooperation to be credible. There were also customs agents who didn't know about Barry's CIA status. Customs, at the time, operated under different oversight than DEA or CIA. When customs agents at a Florida airport noted suspicious activity around Barry's aircraft on a particular flight, they opened an inquiry without checking with anyone at the CIA. The agency's information management was not perfect. Its protection of Barry was robust but not impenetrable. The pressure mounted through 1983 and 1984. Multiple investigations from multiple agencies, none of them fully aware of what the others were doing, none of them fully blocked by the CIA's intervention, building cases that individually might not have been sufficient, but collectively were becoming impossible to ignore. Barry knew this was happening. He wasn't operating blind. He had contacts who fed him information. He knew the investigations were getting closer, but he also believed, with the kind of overconfidence that had characterized his entire career, that he would navigate it, that the CIA would step in at the critical moment, that his protection was stronger than the cases being built against him. He was wrong. In June of 1984, the world Barry Seal had constructed came apart. DIA agents working with Louisiana State Police moved on Barry Seal's operations. It wasn't a single dramatic raid so much as a coordinated enforcement action. Aircraft were seized, documents were recovered, money was found, associates were arrested. And Barry Seal, one of the most successful and long-running drug smugglers in American history, was in handcuffs. The charges were serious: drug traffic, conspiracy. The evidence was substantial. Barry had operated under the assumption that the CIA would intervene before it got to this point. They did not. When the arrest came down, the CIA made a decision that revealed the fundamental nature of their relationship with Barry Seal. They cut ties, they did not intervene, they did not call prosecutors, they did not invoke the asset protection that Barry had believed was his insurance policy. They simply disappeared. Barry Seal had been useful to them. He was now a liability, and the CIA does not protect liabilities. Barry sat in federal custody and understood, probably for the first time with complete clarity, the position he was actually in. He had been an asset. He had never been a partner. He had never been someone they were invested in, protecting beyond the operational utility he provided. The moment protecting him became inconvenient for the organization, the protection evaporated. He was facing charges that, if prosecuted fully and convicted at trial, could mean decades in prison. Life, even. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His associates were cooperating. Documents recovered in the investigation provided paper trails that his lawyers were going to have enormous difficulty explaining. The case was not winnable at trial. So Barry did what smart criminals with knowledge do. He offered to cooperate. Barry Seal's lawyers made contact with prosecutors. The offer on the table was significant. Barry wasn't just going to testify about his own operations. He was going to give the government the Medellin cartel names, dates, locations, methods, the internal structure of the most powerful drug organization in the world, described by someone who had sat in rooms with Pablo Escobar. This was intelligence of incalculable value to DEA and federal prosecutors who had been trying for years to build cases against the cartel leadership. Barry agreed to become a government informant and witness. He agreed to provide testimony in multiple cases. He agreed to work with law enforcement going forward, using his cartel connections to gather evidence. He agreed, in short, to give them everything they wanted. And he did. Over the following months and into 1985, Barry Seal provided testimony and information that was operationally valuable. He described the cartel's smuggling methods in exhaustive detail. He identified personnel. He described the financial systems. He testified in cases against cartel-connected individuals who had been arrested. His knowledge was genuine and specific and damaging to the organization that had made him a millionaire. He also, more carefully and with more reluctance, began touching on the CIA connection. His testimony in some contexts hinted at government involvement in his operations. He was careful. He knew that going fully public on the CIA angle was dangerous in ways that testifying against the cartel might not be. The cartel would try to kill him, but they were a known threat. The CIA, if he exposed them fully, was a different kind of threat, less predictable, harder to protect against. The CIA, for its part, attempted to contain the damage. CIA representatives met with prosecutors. Certain information, they said, was classified. National security required that Barry's testimony not extend into areas that would expose CIA operations. Prosecutors pushed back, but ultimately compromised. Some of Barry's testimony was sealed, some of what he knew went into records that remained classified, some of which are still classified today. The CIA's real goal was straightforward. They needed Barry to stop short of fully exposing their role in the drug trafficking. They needed him to testify against the cartel without testifying too specifically about the CIA's knowledge and facilitation. It was a delicate line. and Barry walked it, partly because he understood that crossing it entirely might make him even more vulnerable. In 1985, Barry Seal was sentenced in federal court. Despite the seriousness of the charges and the enormous volume of cocaine he had smuggled into the United States over more than a decade, his sentence was relatively lenient by the standards of the era: 10 years in federal prison. But the sentence was immediately suspended in favor of probation, in recognition of his cooperation with the government, in recognition of the value of his testimony. He would not go to prison, at least not immediately. There were conditions. He was required to report regularly to a halfway house in Baton Rouge, the Salvation Army Community Treatment Center. He had to be there at specific times on a predictable schedule. This was mandatory. His probation required it. There was no flexibility. Federal authorities offered Barry Seal witness protection. The U.S. Marshals were explicit about it. Go into the program. New identity, new location, round-the-clock security. You will be safe. You can rebuild your life somewhere. The cartel cannot find you. Barry said no. He had reasons, or things he told himself were reasons. He didn't want to leave Louisiana, the state where he'd been born, where his family was, where his whole identity had been constructed. He didn't want to disappear into anonymity, to become someone else, to give up the name and the history that he'd built. He believed he could protect himself. He had carried a gun for years. He had survived in dangerous environments by being smarter and faster than the people trying to get him. He also, I think at some level, didn't fully believe it would happen. Barry Seal had spent his entire adult life defying the consequences that should have caught up with him. He had smuggled explosives on passenger flights and not been caught. He had smuggled marijuana for years and built a substantial operation before anyone moved on him. He had smuggled cocaine for the most powerful cartel in the world for years with CIA protection. He had survived a world that kills most of the people who operate in it. Some part of him may have genuinely believed that his luck was structural rather than statistical, that he was protected not by circumstances, but by something more fundamental. Whatever the reasons, he declined witness protection. He stayed in Baton Rouge. He reported to the halfway house on his court-ordered schedule, on a predictable schedule, in a predictable location that everyone who wanted him dead now knew about. Pablo Escobar had placed a bounty on Barry Seal's head, $500,000. For the man who had been paid $500,000 per trip, this was the cartel's statement about what he was worth to them dead. They brought in a team. Colombian nationals, professional killers, and they sent them to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. In early February 1986, 3 Colombian men arrived in Baton Rouge. Their names, as would later be established through investigation and trial, were Miguel Velez, Luis Carlos Quintero Cruz, and Bernardo Antonio Vasquez. They were professionals. They had been sent by the Medellin cartel with a specific assignment: find Barry Seal and kill him. They began surveillance immediately. Baton Rouge was not a large city. Barry Seal was not a man who operated in the shadows the way a person in witness protection would. He moved around the city, he went places, he had a life, and most importantly, for the hit team's purposes, he reported to the Salvation Army Community Treatment Center on a fixed schedule, at a fixed time, at a fixed location. Surveillance of a man whose location is predictable is not complicated work. The team watched the halfway house. They watched Barry arrive and depart. They learned his vehicle. They learned the timing. They mapped the parking lot. They identified positions. They planned the approach and the escape route, and they waited for the right moment. Barry knew he was a target. He wasn't naive about what testifying against the Medellin cartel meant. He received death threats, phone calls, letters detailed enough about their intentions that they weren't the generic harassment of someone who wanted to frighten him. These were communications from people who had operational plans and wanted him to know it. He told law enforcement, he expressed concern, he was right to be concerned, but he continued to refuse witness protection, he continued to report to the halfway house, he continued to drive his Cadillac to a location that everyone knew he would be at. He had a gun, he varied his daily routine somewhat, he was cautious in the ways that someone who has operated in dangerous environments learns to be cautious, but caution has limits when your location is mandatory and predictable. When the court requires you to be at a specific place at a specific time, you cannot be cautious enough. The hit team didn't need to find Barry. They just needed to wait. The day started normally. Barry Seal woke up at his home in Baton Rouge. He had breakfast. He had children. He had a life that, on a Wednesday morning, looked like any other life. He drove his white Cadillac through the streets of the city where he'd been born. He had been many things in his 46 years. A commercial airline pilot, a drug smuggler, a cartel asset, a CIA operative, a government witness, a man who had made $50 million and was reporting to a halfway house on probation. He pulled into the parking lot of the Salvation Army Community Treatment Center around 6 o'clock in the evening. The light was fading. The parking lot was partially full. There were witnesses around, people coming and going from the facility. Barry parked. He got out of the Cadillac. He began walking toward the building. The three men were waiting. They were armed with MAC-10 submachine guns, compact automatic weapons capable of firing rapidly and at close range with devastating effect. They moved on him in the parking lot. Barry saw them or sensed them. The accounts are not entirely clear on this point. There was no time. There was no opportunity for the gun he carried. The men opened fire. Multiple rounds struck Barry Seal. He fell in the parking lot. The men continued firing, ensuring that what they had started was finished. Then they ran to a waiting vehicle and left. It was over in seconds. The parking lot of a halfway house in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, was suddenly a crime scene. And Barry Adler Berriman Seal, born July 16, 1939, was dead at 46 years old. He had made $50 million. He had worked for Pablo Escobar and the Central Intelligence Agency. He had smuggled more cocaine into the United States than most people could imagine. He had testified against the most dangerous criminal organization in the world. And he died in a parking lot because he wouldn't go into witness protection. Witnesses in the parking lot described what they saw. Three men, automatic weapons, a getaway car driving away at speed. Police arrived within minutes. They knew immediately what they were looking at. This was not a robbery. This was not a domestic dispute. This was a professional assassination. Cartel work. The investigation moved quickly. Louisiana law enforcement and federal agencies began working the case. The identities of the three shooters were established with reasonable speed. Surveillance records, witness descriptions, and intelligence from ongoing cartel investigations pieced together who the hit team was. Two of the three killers, Miguel Velez and Bernardo Antonio Vasquez, fled to Colombia immediately after the shooting. They were beyond the reach of American law enforcement. Colombia at this period was not cooperating meaningfully with U.S. extradition requests, particularly for cartel-connected individuals. Escobar had enough influence over the Colombian justice system through bribery, intimidation, and violence that extradition was essentially impossible for most cartel figures. Velez and Vasquez were, from an American criminal justice perspective, effectively gone. Luis Carlos Quintero Cruz made a different decision. Several months after the shooting, in September 1986, he returned to the United States. The reasons for this are not entirely clear. Perhaps he believed that enough time had passed. Perhaps he had underestimated the investigation's progress. Perhaps he had business in the country that he considered more important than the risk. He was arrested in Florida, extradited to Louisiana, and tried for the murder of Barry Seal. The evidence was overwhelming. Witness testimony, ballistic evidence connecting him to the weapons used, and perhaps most significantly, he ultimately confessed. He was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. Who ordered the murder was never in any serious doubt. Pablo Escobar ordered it, Jorge Ochoa authorized it, the Medellin cartel paid for it. This was confirmed by multiple sources, by Quintero Cruz's own statements, by intelligence gathered from cartel operations, and by the straightforward logic of who benefited and who had the resources. Barry Seal had been their most valuable American asset. Then he had become their most dangerous enemy. In their world, the response to that transition was not complicated. Barry's family was left in an almost impossible situation. His wife, Deborah, and their children had to reckon simultaneously with his death, with the public revelation of exactly what he had been doing for years, and with the government's move to seize most of his assets as drug proceeds. The millions Barry had made were almost entirely gone. Some spent on the lavish lifestyle, some seized by federal authorities, some simply unaccounted for in the chaos of his final years. The family he had provided for so extravagantly was left with the trauma of his death and very little of the money that his crimes had generated. Deborah Seal gave interviews in later years. She was consistent in a few things. She said Barry made terrible choices. She said those choices had consequences that spread far beyond him. She said he was still their father, and that losing him was a real loss, regardless of what he had done. There was grief there, and anger, and a kind of exhausted clarity that comes from having to live in the truth of who someone you loved really was. There is one final detail about Barry Seal's death that I want to include because it speaks to something important about how he understood his own situation. When police searched his Cadillac after the shooting, they found a piece of paper. On it was a quote, a biblical passage from the book of Proverbs. A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Barry Seal was a Catholic. He had been raised in the faith. Whether he was devout in any consistent sense is unclear, but the note suggests that at some level even he recognized that the story of his life had gone in directions he had not planned and could not have predicted, that the outcomes were not entirely of his choosing, even though the choices were. This is not sentiment. It's not an excuse. He chose to smuggle drugs. He chose to work for the cartel. He chose to work for the CIA. He chose to testify against people who would kill him for it. He chose to reject witness protection. Every step of the path was a choice. The note doesn't change any of that. But it does suggest that somewhere, buried under the bravado and the greed and the extraordinary talent for self-justification, Barry Seal understood something that most of us understand, too late or not at all. That the story we think we're living and the story we're actually living are not always the same story. Barry Seal died in February of 1986. The Iran-Contra scandal broke publicly in November of the same year. The timing matters. Barry's death came just months before the revelations that would, in a different world, have made him the most important witness in the most significant American political scandal since Watergate. What was Iran-Contra? Let me explain this clearly, because it's essential to understanding the full context of Barry's story. The Reagan administration was running multiple covert operations simultaneously. One of them was the Contra support operation we've already discussed, the illegal funding and arming of Nicaraguan rebels in violation of the Boland Amendment. Another was a secret effort to sell weapons to Iran. Iran was, at this point, officially an adversary of the United States. There was an arms embargo. The Reagan administration was secretly violating that embargo by selling weapons to Iran, ostensibly in hopes of securing the release of American hostages held in Lebanon by Iranian-backed groups. The connection between these two operations was the money. The Reagan administration took the profits from the Iranian weapons sales and used them to fund the Contras. This was clever from an operational perspective. It created a funding stream that didn't appear in any congressional budget. It didn't require congressional approval. It was, in theory, untraceable. It was a self-financing shadow war funded by illegal weapons sales to an enemy government. This is the Iran-Contra affair. And when it broke publicly in late 1986, it was devastating. In November of 1986, a Lebanese newspaper published a story revealing that the U.S. had been selling arms to Iran. The story spread. The Reagan administration initially denied it, then confirmed parts of it, then scrambled to contain the damage. Then National Security Council aide Oliver North was revealed as a central figure. Documents were shredded, congressional investigations were launched. CIA Director William Casey, who might have been the most important witness, died of a brain tumor in May of 1987 before he could be fully questioned. The hearings that followed were some of the most dramatic moments in American political history. Oliver North testified in his uniform, articulate and unrepentant, framing his illegal actions as patriotic service. John Poindexter, the National Security Advisor, said he had kept President Reagan in the dark specifically so that the president would have deniability. The phrase plausible deniability became part of the American political vocabulary. And in the middle of all of this, the name Barry Seal kept surfacing. In 1988, Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts, then serving on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, led what became known as the Kerry Committee investigation. Its formal title was the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations. Its mandate was to investigate the specific allegation that had been floating around the edges of Iran-Contra, that the CIA, in running the Contra supply operations, had knowingly used drug traffickers and had allowed cocaine to enter the United States. Senator Kerry approached this investigation seriously. He had subpoena power. He had access to classified documents. He could compel testimony. And he used all of these tools over a period of nearly 2 years. The investigation was broad. It looked at multiple smugglers, multiple operations, multiple aspects of the Contra supply network. Barry Seal was central to the investigation, but he was one piece of a larger picture. What the Kerry Committee found was, to anyone paying attention, more significant than almost anything that had come out of the Iran-Contra hearings themselves. The report, published in 1989, confirmed the following: that members of the U.S. State Department, the CIA, and the National Security Council had worked with known drug traffickers. That cocaine had been transported into the United States on aircraft that were part of the Contra supply operation. That drug money had been used to support Contra operations. That U.S. government officials had known about drug trafficking connected to the Contra operations and had done nothing to stop it. The report specifically noted that this was not the activity of rogue agents acting without authorization. The pattern was too consistent, too widespread, and too operationally central to have been the work of a few individuals going outside their mandate. This was institutional. This was policy, even if no written policy document ever said the words, "allow cocaine smuggling to continue." The Kerry Committee report recommended accountability. It named names. It called for prosecutions. It stated clearly that what had occurred was a violation of American law and a betrayal of the American people. Not a single CIA official was prosecuted. The report was released, covered briefly in the press, and then largely buried under the avalanche of news that characterized the late 1980s. It didn't produce the criminal accountability it called for. The cover-up, which had been ongoing since the operations themselves, had worked well enough that the political will for serious prosecution simply wasn't there. One of the most important things to understand about the aftermath of Barry Seal's story is how systematically the government moved to limit what could be known about it. Documents were classified. Not all documents get classified because they contain genuinely sensitive national security information. Some documents get classified because the information in them would be embarrassing or criminal if it became public. The CIA classified enormous quantities of material related to the Contra operations and the drug trafficking. Some of this material has been partially released through Freedom of Information Act requests over the years. Some of it remains classified to this day. Barry Seal's own testimony in the court cases where he appeared before his death was partially sealed. The CIA negotiated limitations on what he could testify about. This was done under the rubric of national security, but the practical effect was to limit how much of the CIA's role in the drug trafficking could be established in a public court proceeding. The sealed portions remain sealed. Witnesses who knew things were, in some cases, discouraged from coming forward. In other cases, their credibility was attacked by people with institutional interests in keeping the story contained. The machinery of reputation destruction, which is one of the ways powerful institutions protect themselves from exposure, was applied to people who threatened to say too much. Gary Webb is perhaps the most significant example of this. Webb was a journalist for the San Jose Mercury News. In 1996, 10 years after Barry Seal's death, he published a series of articles called Dark Alliance that documented connections between CIA-backed Contra operations and the crack cocaine epidemic in Los Angeles. Webb's reporting was serious. It was documented. It was based on real sources and real records, and it specifically connected the cocaine supply chain to the devastation of black communities in Los Angeles. The response from the major American media institutions was extraordinary in its ferocity. The Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post all published pieces attacking Webb's reporting. They questioned his sourcing. They characterized his conclusions as overreaching. They treated the story as fringe journalism rather than serious investigative work. Webb's editors at the Mercury News eventually distanced themselves from his reporting. Webb was professionally destroyed. He lost his career. He lost his financial stability. He lost his reputation in the industry he had dedicated his life to. In 2004, he was found dead with 2 gunshot wounds to his head. The death was ruled a suicide with 2 gunshot wounds to the head. This detail is noted not as conspiracy, but because it is factually strange and has never been fully explained. In subsequent years, many of the specific claims in Dark Alliance were confirmed by subsequent investigations, including by a CIA Inspector General report in 1998 that acknowledged the CIA had known about drug trafficking by assets and had not reported it to law enforcement as required by law. Webb was right in his major conclusions. He was professionally destroyed before that truth was acknowledged. This is what happens to people who expose things that powerful institutions want kept secret. In 2017, director Doug Liman released American Made. Tom Cruise played Barry Seal. It was a well-made film, energetically directed, with Cruise doing what Cruise does best, making an audience like a character they probably shouldn't like. The film made over $134 million worldwide. A lot of people saw it, and for many of them, it was their introduction to the name Barry Seal. The movie got some things right. I want to be fair about this because the inaccuracies I'm going to describe in the next section are significant, and they land differently when you acknowledge first what the film did capture accurately. Barry's skills as a pilot are depicted with genuine fidelity. The flying sequences in the film are accurate in their portrayal of the kind of low-altitude, high-skill, high-risk flying that Barry actually did. Tom Cruise took flying seriously for the role, and the film communicates something real about the relationship Barry had with aircraft and with the sensation of flight. The basic structure of the smuggling operation is correct. Barry flew cocaine from Colombia. He used small aircraft. He used remote airstrips. He had a fleet of aircraft registered under shell companies. The mechanics of the operation, as shown in the film, correspond to what is documented in court records and congressional testimony. The CIA recruitment is depicted in the film, and the fundamental reality of it is accurate. Barry was recruited by the CIA. He flew reconnaissance missions, he delivered weapons to Contras, he received protection from law enforcement. The film shows all of these things happening, which is more than most Hollywood productions about this period bother to do. The Mena, Arkansas operation is shown in the film, and the film is accurate that Mena was a central hub for Barry's CIA-connected operations. The film actually spends meaningful time in Mena, which is historically appropriate. The photographs of Pablo Escobar are depicted in the film, and the core of that story, Barry using a camera to photograph Escobar at a cartel meeting, is accurate. The subsequent leak of the photographs and the damage it did to Barry's cartel relationships is also captured, at least in outline. And the murder is depicted accurately in its essentials. Barry was shot to death in a parking lot in Baton Rouge on February 19, 1986, by cartel assassins. The film shows this happening and doesn't soften it. That's to its credit. The list of what the film got wrong is longer and more significant than what it got right. The tone is the most fundamental problem. American Made is an adventure comedy. It is fun. It is charming. Tom Cruise's Barry Seal is a lovable rogue who stumbles into increasingly improbable situations and navigates them with wit and charm. The audience roots for him. The audience enjoys watching him get away with things. The film's energy is that of a caper movie, a heist film, something in the tradition of The Italian Job or Catch Me If You Can. You leave the theater having had a good time. The real story is not something you have a good time with. The real story is a man who knowingly smuggled enormous quantities of cocaine into the United States for years, contributing to an epidemic that destroyed communities, killed people, and imprisoned hundreds of thousands of Americans who used the product he supplied. His victims are faceless in the film because acknowledging their existence would break the comedic tone completely. The film needs you to see Barry as a rogue, not as a man whose choices contributed to mass suffering. Barry's character in the film is substantially more likable than the historical record suggests. The real Barry Seal was not a charming everyman caught up in circumstances beyond his control. He was a greedy, calculating criminal who made choices with full knowledge of their nature and was extraordinarily good at rationalizing them. He had a gift for self-justification that allowed him to compartmentalize the human cost of his work. This is psychologically real, but it is not charming, and the film doesn't depict it. The CIA's role is shown in the film, but is substantially softened. In American Made, the CIA comes across as bumbling, disorganized, almost comedically inept. They're bureaucrats who don't quite know what they're doing, who bring Barry into a situation that gets out of hand. This characterization lets the agency off the hook in a way the historical record does not support. The real CIA personnel involved in these operations were not bumbling bureaucrats. They were professionals who made deliberate decisions with clear awareness of the consequences. The decision to allow cocaine to flow into the United States in exchange for operational utility was not an accident or an oversight. It was a choice. The film's comedic depiction of the CIA obscures this. The scale of what Barry did is undersold. The film shows some smuggling, it shows some money, It does not convey the reality that Barry Seal was, across his career, one of the largest cocaine smugglers in American history, responsible for bringing in quantities of the drug that contributed to one of the worst public health crises in modern America. Showing the real scale would require the film to also show the human cost, and the human cost would destroy the tone. The consequences for communities are almost entirely absent from the film. The crack epidemic doesn't exist in American Made. The communities destroyed by the cocaine Barry flew in are not part of the story. The racial dynamics of who went to prison while Barry was protected are not addressed. The film's world is almost exclusively white and middle class, and the people most devastated by the cocaine trade are invisible. The institutional racism built into the war on drugs while this was happening is not touched. The film doesn't note that the very government that was protecting Barry Seal from prosecution was simultaneously incarcerating Black Americans for possessing the same cocaine Barry was supplying. This omission is not incidental. It is a choice. And it is a choice that allows the audience to enjoy the story without being confronted with its most disturbing dimensions. I want to be honest about why American Made is the film it is, rather than a harder, more accurate version of itself. Because Hollywood Lies isn't a sufficient explanation. The film was made as entertainment. Doug Liman is a skilled commercial director. Tom Cruise is one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. They were not making a documentary. They were making a film designed to attract large audiences and generate profit. Those goals are not inherently wrong, but they have consequences for what kind of film gets made. A film that fully depicted the human cost of the cocaine Barry Seal smuggled, that showed the crack houses and the overdoses and the prison sentences and the communities hollowed out by addiction, would not be a fun Tom Cruise adventure film. It would be a genuinely disturbing piece of work. It might be a great film. It would probably not be a commercially successful one. A film that depicted the CIA's deliberate choice to allow cocaine to flood American communities with full awareness of the consequences, without the comedic buffoonery that softens the agency's culpability in the film, would require the audience to be angry in a way that doesn't make for a comfortable movie-going experience. Barry Seal's real story is not a romp. It is a tragedy with deeply political and moral dimensions. Hollywood is equipped to make that kind of film, but it requires the willingness to alienate audiences, to make them uncomfortable, to deny them the cathartic resolution that entertainment usually provides. That willingness doesn't often coexist with a $130 million Tom Cruise vehicle. The result is a film that is entertaining, but fundamentally incomplete. A film that gives you the surface of the story without the substance. A film that will send curious viewers to search for the real history, which is what my hope is that it did for many of you who ended up here. I want to take a moment to consolidate what we have established in this video that is documented, sourced, and beyond reasonable dispute, because I've been careful throughout to distinguish between what is proven and what is alleged, and I want to be equally careful here at the end. The CIA used drug traffickers in their Contra support operations. This is confirmed by the Kerry Committee report, published in 1989, which is a public document of the United States Senate. This is not disputed. This is a documented congressional finding. Barry Seal smuggled cocaine from Colombia to the United States for the Medellin cartel. This is established by federal court records, his own testimony, and the investigations that led to his arrest and prosecution. There is no serious dispute about this. Barry Seal was recruited by and operated for the CIA during a portion of his smuggling career. This is confirmed by congressional investigations, by DEA records that document the protection he received, and by multiple witnesses who testified under oath. DEA agents who sought to prosecute Barry Seal were told to stand down because he was a CIA asset. This is documented in DEA records and confirmed by agents who testified about their frustration with this situation. The CIA was aware that cocaine was being smuggled on flights connected to the Contra support operations. This is confirmed by the Kerry Committee report, by CIA Inspector General findings released in 1998, and by testimony of multiple witnesses. No CIA official was prosecuted for their role in allowing drug trafficking. This is a documented fact about the outcome of the various investigations. Barry Seal was assassinated on February 19, 1986, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, by hitmen sent by the Medellin cartel. This is established by the criminal trial that convicted one of the shooters. The cocaine that Barry Seal and other CIA-connected smugglers brought into the United States contributed to the crack epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s, which devastated primarily Black and Latino communities in American cities. This connection is documented and acknowledged in multiple official investigations. These are the things we know. There are things that remain uncertain, classified, or simply not established by available evidence. Intellectual integrity requires acknowledging them. We don't know precisely how much cocaine Barry Seal smuggled in total. The estimates vary widely. Some court documents suggest figures in the tens of thousands of kilograms over his career. Some investigators believe it was much more. The precise total has never been definitively established. We don't know exactly how high within the CIA the knowledge of drug trafficking went. We know it went high enough to prevent the DEA from prosecuting Barry. We know it went high enough to be institutional rather than isolated. But the specific individuals who made the specific decisions to allow cocaine to flow and how far up the chain those decisions were cleared is not fully established. We don't know whether President Reagan himself knew. The evidence, by design, was structured so that plausible deniability could be maintained. Whether that deniability was real, whether Reagan was genuinely unaware of what was being done in his administration's name, or whether the deniability structure was constructed around someone who knew exactly what was happening, is something the available evidence doesn't definitively resolve. We don't know whether the CIA in any way facilitated or allowed Barry Seal's murder. The cartel killed him, that is clear. But some investigators and journalists have noted that the CIA could have pushed harder for witness protection, that they could have arranged better security, that they chose not to, at a moment when Barry, with his knowledge of their operations, was becoming an ever greater liability. Whether this was passive negligence or something more deliberate is not established. These uncertainties matter. The facts that are established are damning enough, but intellectual honesty requires acknowledging the line between what is proven and what is suspected. The war on drugs is one of the most consequential and one of the most fraudulent policy frameworks in American history, and the story of Barry Seal puts its fraudulence in the starkest possible relief. The war on drugs was declared in the early 1970s by President Nixon and massively escalated under President Reagan in the 1980s. Its premise was simple. Illegal drug use was destroying American society, and the solution was aggressive law enforcement, severe mandatory minimum sentences, and the disruption of drug supply chains. The government would fight drugs with everything it had. While this framework was being articulated, the CIA was running operations that required drug smugglers as assets. They were protecting those smugglers from prosecution. They were allowing cocaine to enter the United States because the Nicaragua operation was more important. The war on drugs was being prosecuted by one agency of the government while another agency of the same government was enabling the drug trade. The mandatory minimum sentences that came with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, passed the same year Barry Seal was murdered, created the notorious 100-to-1 disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentencing. 5 grams of crack cocaine triggered a mandatory 5-year prison sentence. It took 500 grams of powder cocaine to trigger the same sentence. This disparity was applied in a country where crack was predominantly used in black communities and powder cocaine was predominantly used by white, higher-income users. The racial consequences were immediate and enormous. Black Americans were imprisoned for crack offenses at rates massively disproportionate to their share of drug use. This was the war on drugs. This was what it actually looked like when it was applied. Poor black Americans imprisoned for years for small quantities of crack cocaine, while the CIA's connected smugglers brought in the supply that made the crack epidemic possible with the knowledge and protection of the federal government. If you want to understand institutional racism in America, you don't have to reach for abstract theory. You can just follow the cocaine. Who brought it in? With whose protection? Who went to prison for it? The answer to the first question is largely white men like Barry Seal, operating with CIA protection. The answer to the second question is largely black Americans caught with the product those men supplied. The system was not neutral. The system was not broken. The system was working exactly as designed, benefiting certain people and destroying others with extraordinary consistency. One of the most important and disturbing lessons of the Barry Seal story is how well the system protected itself. This is worth examining carefully because it speaks to something fundamental about how powerful institutions operate. Barry Seal was killed, 1 low-level cartel operative was convicted of the murder, 2 escaped, no CIA officials were prosecuted, no Reagan administration officials were prosecuted for drug trafficking. Oliver North was convicted on 3 felony counts related to Iran-Contra, but those convictions were subsequently overturned on appeal. Oliver North went on to become a political commentator and, briefly, president of the National Rifle Association. No one with significant power in the government went to prison for enabling a drug operation that helped fuel the worst drug epidemic in American history. Documents were classified, the cover-up worked, the congressional investigations produced findings but not prosecutions. The media largely moved on. Gary Webb, who tried to force the story to remain in public consciousness, was professionally destroyed. This is how powerful institutions survive scandal. Not through innocence, not through the facts being on their side, but through the institutional resources to manage the timeline of public attention. Delay long enough, classify enough, attack the credibility of enough people who threaten to expose you, and the political will for accountability fades. Scandals that would be career-ending for an individual are survivable for institutions because institutions don't have careers that can be ended. They continue existing, they wait out the attention cycle, and then they continue operating. The people who paid the price for the CIA's decision to allow drug trafficking were not in Langley, Virginia. They were in South Central Los Angeles, in the Bronx, in Baltimore, in Chicago, in all the places where the cocaine that flowed through the CIA-connected supply chain ended up. They were the addicts and the dealers and the people caught in the crossfire of the violence the drug trade generates. They were the people incarcerated under the mandatory minimums passed in response to the epidemic that the government had partly enabled. They were Barry Seal's victims, diffuse and faceless and unheard, while the people who made the decisions that created the conditions for their suffering faced no consequences at all. I want to conclude the substantive portion of this video by talking about what we should take away from everything we've covered, not just as history, but as citizens of a country whose government is capable of what we've documented here. The first lesson is that the story the government tells you about itself is not the complete story. This is not cynicism. This is not paranoia. This is a documented historical fact. The Reagan administration told the American people they were fighting a war on drugs. They were not fighting a war on drugs. They were fighting a war on Nicaragua. And the war on Nicaragua required them to look away from the drugs. The Just Say No campaign was real in the sense that Nancy Reagan really did appear on television and say those words. And the CIA's facilitation of cocaine smuggling was also real. Both of these things were happening simultaneously. The gap between the official narrative and the operational reality was vast, and the people operating in that gap were not held accountable. The second lesson is about what gets classified and why. The government classifies information for many reasons. Sometimes the reasons are genuinely about national security, protecting sources and methods, protecting ongoing operations, protecting diplomatic relationships. These are real considerations. But classification is also used to protect the government from accountability. When the CIA classifies documents about drug trafficking, it is not primarily protecting America from foreign threats. It is protecting itself from American citizens. The power to classify information is the power to determine what history is knowable, and that power has been systematically abused. The third lesson is about the cost of oversight failure. Congress passed the Boland Amendment. Congress said clearly and legally that the Contra operation was forbidden. The CIA proceeded anyway, not because the law was unclear, not because there was some genuine interpretation that permitted what they did, but because they believed the goal was important enough to break the law for, and they calculated correctly that they could get away with it. The oversight mechanisms that are supposed to prevent this failed. Congressional oversight failed. Inspector General oversight failed. The checks on executive branch power that the Constitution created were insufficient to stop a determined intelligence agency operating in the dark. This should concern anyone who believes in democratic governance. The fourth lesson is about race and the war on drugs specifically. The crack epidemic was real. The addiction was real. The destruction was real. But the response to it, the incarceration of Black Americans at enormously disproportionate rates for a drug that the government had knowingly allowed to flow into their communities, was a moral catastrophe of historic proportions. You cannot look at this history and conclude that the criminal justice response to crack cocaine was simply neutral law enforcement. It was law enforcement applied with enormous severity to the victims of a supply chain that the government had protected. The injustice is not subtle. It is massive, documented, and ongoing in its consequences. The fifth lesson is about accountability and power. No one with real power in this story was held accountable. Barry Seal was killed. The cartel assassins were largely untouchable. CIA officials went unprosecuted. Reagan administration figures were not held to account for drug trafficking. The people who went to prison were the low-level dealers and users who were the most visible, most vulnerable part of the chain. This is a consistent pattern in American institutional history. Power protects itself. Accountability flows downward. The people with the least power in any system tend to face its most severe consequences, while the people with the most power tend to survive their failures intact. Let me tell you the story one more time. The whole story, in its full dimensions, from beginning to end. Adler Berryman Seal was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1939. He fell in love with flying as a child and became one of the most naturally gifted pilots of his generation. He flew commercially for TWA. He was one of the youngest 707 captains in American aviation history. And then because he wanted more money than his legitimate career could provide, and because he had an addiction to adrenaline that ordinary life couldn't satisfy, he started smuggling. First explosives, then marijuana, then cocaine. By the early 1980s, he was one of the most successful independent cocaine smugglers in the country. And the Medellin cartel, Pablo Escobar's organization, came calling. They offered him $500,000 per trip. He said yes. Over several years, he flew hundreds of kilograms of cocaine into the United States per trip, making somewhere between $25 and $50 million. The cocaine he brought in fueled the crack epidemic. It destroyed communities, it killed people, and he compartmentalized all of that, because compartmentalization is the only way you can do what he was doing and keep looking at yourself in the mirror. Then the CIA came calling. They needed him for Nicaragua. They needed his aircraft, his contacts, his skill, his willingness to operate outside the law. They offered him protection from the DEA investigations that were closing in. He said yes. And the same planes that brought cocaine into America started bringing weapons out to Central America. The CIA knew about the cocaine. They allowed it. They needed Barry more than they wanted to stop the drugs. This is documented in congressional records. This is not disputed. When Barry was finally arrested in 1984, the CIA abandoned him. He had been useful. He was now a liability. He offered to cooperate with prosecutors. He testified against the cartel. He helped convict cartel-connected individuals. He began hinting at CIA involvement, and he declined witness protection because he couldn't bring himself to become someone else, to leave Louisiana, to abandon the identity he had built. On February 19, 1986, the Medellin cartel sent 3 men to a parking lot in Baton Rouge. They shot him with machine guns. He died at 46 years old. 1 killer was eventually caught and convicted. 2 escaped to Colombia. No one from the CIA was ever prosecuted. The Iran-Contra scandal broke in November of 1986. Congressional investigations confirmed what Barry Seal's story had hinted at. The CIA had been running illegal operations, using drug traffickers, allowing cocaine to enter the United States, and funding an illegal war in Nicaragua. The Kerry Committee report, published in 1989, documented all of this in exhaustive, official, congressional detail, and no one was prosecuted for it. The cover-up worked, the system protected itself. Tom Cruise made a fun movie about it in 2017. The movie was entertaining. It was incomplete. The truth was darker. The truth was that a man made $50 million bringing cocaine into the country with the knowledge and protection of the government that was simultaneously imprisoning Americans for drug crimes. The truth was that the war on drugs was a propaganda framework applied with racial selectivity by a government that was enabling the drug supply. The truth was that the people who made these decisions faced no consequences, and the people who suffered from them had no voice. That is the complete, documented truth about Barry Seal. That is what really happened. If you watched this entire investigation from beginning to end, thank you. I mean that genuinely. This kind of content requires patience and attention and a willingness to sit with difficult information. You gave that. Hit subscribe right now. This is the work I do. Real history, real research, real sources. The stories that get sanitized into entertainment and the truth that lives underneath them. If you want to go deeper on the stories that define the world we live in, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Like this video right now, not as a formality, because the documented truth about government drug trafficking deserves to reach as many people as possible. Your like helps the algorithm understand that this content matters. Help it reach people who haven't heard this story yet. And comment below, I want to know a few things. Did you know about Iran-Contra before today? Does the Kerry Committee report change how you think about the war on drugs? And the central question, should CIA officials have been prosecuted for knowingly allowing cocaine to flood American communities? Tell me what you think. I read every comment. Share this video, not because you liked it in the way you like entertainment, but because the people in your life deserve to know that while their government was telling them to just say no, it was protecting one of the biggest cocaine smugglers in American history. That information belongs to everyone. Tom Cruise made Barry Seal look like a charming rogue living the adventure of his life. And in a certain light, that's a version of the truth. But in the full light, the documented, congressional record, court document light, Barry Seal was a criminal who worked for a criminal enterprise that wore a suit and carried a government ID. He made $50 million. He helped enable the crack epidemic. He testified against murderers and was murdered himself. And the people who made the decisions that created the conditions for everything he did walked away clean. That should make you angry. Not in a way that's useful to channel at each other, but in a way that makes you pay attention. In a way that makes you ask questions. In a way that makes you read the Kerry Committee report, which I'm linking in the description, and understand that this is not fringe history. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the official, documented, congressional finding about what your government did. Barry Seal died in a parking lot in Baton Rouge in 1986. The CIA outlived him. The institutions that made these decisions outlived him. The documents that might tell us everything are still classified. The full truth may never be public, but this much is public, this much is documented, and now you know it. See you in the next one.